Welcome to the lecture on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, our first Victorian poet. So just a little bit of history going back to primarily what your book says. Elizabeth was very popular in her own time and considered a greater poet than her husband Robert Browning, considered one of the finest poets ever. And then she kind of fell out of favor for quite a long time, where people thought her writing very didactic. They thought it was technically maybe too irregular. They also thought perhaps that she was, her topics, especially in like Aurora Leigh, were a little bit shocking. A woman writing about a woman writer. But she now has kind of a better reputation, especially when we look at some of the social justice kind of poems that she wrote about slavery and about child labor, those kind of things. We are reading from Sonnets of the Portuguese because this is, an intro class, so to speak, and that's what she is most best known as. But you can read the other poems. You might want to do your literary study guide about the other aspects of her writing in those more social justice kind of poems. Um, so her personal life, she was given quite an advanced knowledge education. She studied Latin and Greek from her brother's tutor. She was one of 11 children. um, she was a voracious reader and, quite lively. But then she had an accident. Her brother drowned, and she had a back injury that left her, um, you know, not paralyzed, but very compromised. She also had ill health. She has what we now see as tuberculosis. And so she was pretty much kept in what they, I think your book says, semi seclusion by her father, who was pretty much of a tyrant who forbade any of his children to get married. But even with that, and again, she was quite ill, um, she maintained a real lively correspondence with other writers. And one of these writers was Robert Browning. And so she had written to him and had written about what a great author he was. Now, Browning was not necessarily considered a great author in his own time. I mentioned she was considered a much better author. He had a very unique style and a different approach, and people really just didn't know what to make of his use of form and things like that. Browning has since then become considered one of the greatest writers. But at the time, he took a lot of hits. And so the fact that she was so complimentary of him and she had such a reputation, he started writing back to her, and he confessed that he was in love with her just because she loved his work. And so eventually they did fall in love through their correspondence. Um, by this time, Elizabeth is in her late 30s, and Browning comes and sees her finally, and he proposes to her. But of course, her father won't let her get married, and they actually have to sneak off and elope. And her father just like cuts her out of their lives. Doesn't want anything else to do with her. There's a mini series called The Barretts of Wimpole Street. That was done probably in the late 70s. I remember watching it with my mother, and I don't know how factual it was, but I remember that in the story, Elizabeth had a dog that was her companion that she loved greatly, and they couldn't take the dog with them as they were running away. And her father supposedly had the dog put to death as punishment. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but that kind of reflects the way he was. They moved to Italy, right, where her health got better because, like Keats, remember Keats also had tuberculosis. The English environment isn't really great for respiratory problems, so going to Italy was, where it was dry and warmer. So she lived for another 15 or so years married to Browning, and they were, from all accounts, ecstatic. They had a son named Penn, that, she got to see grow to a young man. And she lived a quite thriving, wonderful life. She got involved again in social issues, but also taking up the banner of Italian nationalism, um, and writing about it in some of her works. They lived in a place called Casa Guidi, right? And she died in 1861 there. We'll talk a little bit about Browning when we get to him and about how he reacted to that later. Um, so, as your book says, her poetry has a fervent moral sensibility. And we're going to see this in the two poems that we're reading by her. And that's connected primarily to her idea of love and relationships. But again, when we look at the other poems that are in our book and other things, we're going to still see that, though directed in another aspect. And it's those other poems that kind of are about that sense of social justice that she's talking about, that we see the Victorians talking about. But here we also see with the sonnets from the Portuguese, some of the things that are limiting about writing. I think these poems are very clearly continuing the romantic idea of that confessional poem, though they are written by a woman and they aren't about nature or anything like that, about revealing truths. It's really about how love has revealed these truths and this eternalness to her. These are written for Browning. They are things that she started writing quite early in their relationship. So if you read all of the sonnets, they go through these moments of doubt. I mean, you got to think she's an older woman. She's been a recluse. She doesn't have a great hope of living a long life. You know, how would she feel about this dynamic? And Browning was a very virile, build the cabin with his own hands kind of guy, very much, about life and all that. You got to figure she had a lot of doubts about would she live up to his image of her, would they be able to have a relationship. So we go through these poems of doubt and certainty and all of that she writes to him. They were personal poems, and Browning, her husband Robert, suggested that she publish them, but that maybe she says sonnets from the Portuguese, that would maybe imply that she had translated them from Portuguese into English, because they were very intimate private poems, and that would have been a bit of an odd thing for a woman to have been writing this way. And so that's what she did, right? That she disguised the sonnets as a translation, right? So let's look at number 22. There are many wonderful, wonderful poems in this sonnet sequence. These are the two. I wish there had been more in our book, but these were the two I thought were obviously "How Do I Love Thee" is the most famous, one of the most famous sonnets ever. This one is not necessarily as famous, but I think it's actually maybe better than Sonnet 43. So this is iambic pentameter, though it is irregular. She is not a great technician when it comes to finding a way to use the English language in this that real rigid sonnet structure, very perfectly. She does have caesuras and things like that, but it's still a sonnet. It is a Petrarchan sonnet in terms of its rhyme scheme, but it is not a perfect octave sestet, which we see in the Petrarch. It's more, like I said, 8.5 lines and 5.5 lines in terms of that. Um, the idea is that loving each other on earth is better than eternity because they are together without any interruptions or distractions, right? Um, and there is the fear that death will separate them, that their souls will be torn apart, right? And so this idea, then why would we want to die? If as long as we're alive, we'll be right here together, right? Um, so in terms of the figurative language, we have personification. Their souls stand erect, almost like they're at the wedding altar, right? There's metaphor that the song that the angels might drop on them is like a golden orb. And the souls are angels, right? They talk about their lengthening wings that almost reach each other tip to tip until the flame, right, flames. When I read this, I think very much of John Donne's poetry, and that as so for me, there's some metaphysical kind of involved here, poetry involved here, especially in the idea that John Donne had of the macrocosm versus the microcosm. So the macrocosm would be the entire world, the big picture. The microcosm is the little world, right? And so he has a poem where he talks about that the lovers have created their own world and they are completely self-sustained within that. And their love and their purpose in this world, their importance in this world is more important than the sun, than kings, than anything, right? And I think very much we have that same kind of feel here with this poem, right? So she says, when our two souls stand up erect and strong face to face, silent, drawing nigh and nigher, until the lengthening wings break into fire at either curved point. So notice the enjambment that some of these lines go beyond, right? What bitter wrong can the earth do to us that we should not long be here contented? So she's saying, what could the world do that we wouldn't be happy being alive, right? Some people want to escape this world, right? That they can be then the just pure entity of soul, right? She's saying, but what could be so bad on earth that would triumph, be transcended over the joy that we have together, right? Think, she says, in mounting higher, the angels. So if our souls went higher, right, up into the ether, right, in mounting higher, the angels would press on us and aspire to drop some golden orb of perfect song into our deep, dear silence. So we have this connection that is wordless, and the angels would try to put some kind of angelic music to it, right? She says, let us stay rather on earth, beloved, where the unfit, contrarious moods of men recoil away and isolate pure spirits and permit a place to stand and love in for a day, with darkness and the death hour rounding it. So she says, again, we can be here and where we will recoil from the contentious, right? All of the things that men do, right? That this will help us isolate ourselves because we are pure. We're not part of that contentious, contrary mood, right? And we can stand here and in a day love, right? No matter that death is around us, that we know we're not going to live forever, right? That the darkness, that might be the darkness of um, the world around them in terms of what's going wrong in society, but again, in the fact that death is coming. She says, our souls are eternal and they will be able to withstand this. And in fact, all of this darkness actually allows us to cling together much more closely and more purely, right? I mean, what a great sonnet, right? So now let's look at the second one. By the way, these are published in 1850, though, like I said, she wrote them throughout a long time with her correspondence with him. This is iambic pentameter. It is Petrarchan as well. We have that Petrarchan rhyme scheme. And in this, we have the octave and the sestet. But I think you could almost see that this is broken into those three quatrains and the couplet. I had at one point when I was looking at this, like, well, this is almost Shakespearean in the way that these lines can group in the 4, 4, 4, and 2. But also we can see that in the first 8 lines, we have a focus on the metaphysical, on the kind of pure and innocent aspect of love. And then in the sestet, it comes down to much more earthly, passionate kind of things that's kind of more of that experienced, right? One of the ironies people look at here is that she's saying, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. So she starts off with anaphora, which, I'm sorry, not anaphora, um, aporia, right? This rhetorical question that she's going to answer. Let me count the ways. So she's almost like I can enumerate them, that they are physical things that I can count. And yet most of what she talks about are abstract qualities. So there's kind of this interesting paradox of what she's given, that she's counting things that actually have no physical form, right? And she connects her love to him in all aspects of her life. So I've written some of the things that she covers. She talks about how religion and faith, and then spiritual, things that are beyond just particular religion. She talks about innocence versus experience, right? She talks about justice and morality, passion and romance, life and death, the past, present, and the future, right? And so some of the themes we see here are love, faith, and grief or loss, right? And then we do see assonance. We have metaphor. The soul is a physical form. It's kind of an implied metaphor. But lines 2 to 3, we see that. We see anaphora, which is the repetition of the word or phrase. So she talks about love. I love thee, I love thee, I love thee. She uses many of the 5 senses, so this has a lot of imagery that evokes these senses. There is hyperbole. I shall love thee, but better after death. That's exaggeration. And then we have apostrophe. She's talking to her lover, thee, and again, from far away, right? So let's look at it. So, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. So this is where we have that personification that this, I mean, the soul doesn't have height and depth and breadth, right? But she's giving it that like it's a concrete body, right? So she says, I love these to just as far as my soul can reach, right? When I am feeling out of sight of grace and the ends of life, right? She says, I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. So throughout the day and by night, I love thee to my most quiet need, right? So that means that there's obviously needs that we understand. They're very overt and in our face, but they're also small needs. He fulfills all of that to her most quiet need, right? She says, I love thee freely as men strive for right. So this is where she has that justice, right? But she also loves him purely as they turn from praise, right? So this is kind of that morality kind of aspect, right? That it is everything that's best about human experience, right? She says, I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. So there's that innocence and experience, right? I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. So when she lost faith, which remember, we think about the Victorians as having these crises of faith, the love that she had for that, she loves him that way. And she says, I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. So again, everything about me. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Right. And so past, present, and future. She talks about her childhood. She talks about who she is today. And she talks about in the future and then even beyond, right? When time has no meaning, I'll continue to love thee. Right. So again, it's about love being all encompassing and being completely its own entity. Right. Again, a little bit different, I think, than what we've seen in the romantic poets, who have perhaps, other than maybe Keats, have maybe a more abstract way of talking about love. It's more at a distance, right? Whereas this is a very immediate, intimate kind of way of talking about love, that she's talking not at him, but to him. Right. And so, these are just examples of that kind of writing. And even when you look at the cry of the children or the other things in here, we're still going to have that same very intimate, moral kind of tone to her writing that isn't it that it's that I mean, even though it is about abstract ideas, it's also about real things that we can, I think, connect to. The romantics, oftentimes they were talking about these big abstract ideas, but here this is a very realistic kind of poem that I think we can understand if we've ever loved anybody. We can, or ever been in love with someone, and that rapture's like, oh, how can I live without them? This really, I think, resonates with us. So I hope you enjoy Elizabeth Barrett, Browning. And again, read some more of the other stuff in here to get a real good sense of more of the variety of her poetry. So our next lecture will be on Tennyson, one of my favorites.